The Ink That Waited, a court scribe's night in Abbasid Baghdad, 832 CE. The last golden light of the sun stretches lazily across the courtyard, spilling over tiled stone and carved cedarwood inlays. In the distance, the great river Tigris moves like molten copper, catching the dying sun in slow, glimmering ripples. A breeze stirs the latticework screens that guard the shaded corridors, rustling them with the same patience one might hear in a turning page. This is the hour before the palace dims, when voices hush not because they must, but because the evening invites it. In the inner courtyard of the Beit al-Hikmah, the house of wisdom, date palms lean quietly, and a single fig tree casts long, thoughtful shadows against the mosaic wall. Between them, a narrow fountain murmurs softly, its water catching pink threads of sunset. The air smells faintly of rosewater and dusted papyrus, and the high dome above catches the last sunbeam like an upturned bowl of light. Somewhere nearby, sandals scuff gently against the tiled floor, an old man's careful steps. His name is Abu Zaid, and though he is small of frame, he carries a calm presence like ink held in a well. His robes are modest, dyed in softened indigo, with the cuff edges darkened by years of close writing. His beard, once dyed red with henna, has faded now to gray. But his eyes, sharp and dark, still read the world like a manuscript. As he crosses beneath the colonnade, he does not rush. He is in no hurry. Night will come. The words will wait. Abu Zaid's fingers brush the wood of the scriptorium's door, no hinge, no lock, just a carved cedar slab that rests in place and swings quietly aside when pushed. Inside, the room is long, lit by narrow lamps suspended from silver hooks. The walls are lined with scrolls and folded manuscripts, some wrapped in silk bands, others in goat parchment stitched at the corners. A writing table awaits him, unadorned save for a shallow oil lamp and a weighty inkwell shaped like a fig. The inkwell has not been opened since sunrise. He lowers himself onto a cushion, knees folding beneath him with practiced ease. His joints, which once bent like reeds, now creak softly. He sets a scroll before him, then reaches for his reed pen, a callum, cut at a precise angle, its tip honed by the same knife he has carried for 40 years. Before writing, he breathes. Once in, once out. He listens. Outside, the muezzin's call to Maghrib echoes from the minaret, a long, lilting note that turns like a spindle in the still air. Abu Zaid bows his head in silence. In this room, prayer is constant, even in the spaces between ink strokes. He lifts the callum. It hovers, but he does not begin to write. Not yet. Silence returns, deeper now. The palace beyond his chamber grows quieter with each passing minute. Guards speak less, their boots softened on mosaic paths. The cook's fires dim. And in the scriptorium, the only sound is the slow, deliberate breathing of an old man who has written 10,000 pages but knows that the best lines wait in stillness. Abu Zaid glances at the text before him. It is a report, mundane, bureaucratic, but necessary. A record of grain storage in Samarra, dictated by a vizier who does not care for poetry, only precision. But even precision, in his view, is an art. He adjusts the scroll and dips his callum. The first stroke is smooth, one word, then another. The ink flows patiently. There is no flourish, only clarity. Every curve of the Arabic script rests with elegance, no character louder than the next. Even in the routine, there is rhythm. He pauses to blot gently with a piece of linen, the kind dyed in saffron and cut to palm size. Then he continues. Hours pass like the drift of incense. Outside, the city hums faintly, but it is the scribe's pen that speaks clearest in this hour. A soft knock at the cedar door interrupts the quiet. Not urgent, more a question than a command. Abu Zaid looks up, ink still wet at his fingertips. A boy enters, barefoot, lean, eyes bright from running. He carries a sealed scroll tied with green thread. From the vizier, the boy says, respectful. He bows and waits. Abu Zaid nods and takes the scroll gently, unfastening the thread with practiced fingers. Inside, not a grain record, but a letter. A private one. The vizier's seal bears a tulip, an old symbol of truth before formality. The letter is short but strange. It requests a second copy of a decree that was never delivered. It references a royal poet whose verses were never archived. It ends with the words, "He must not see this ink dry." Abu Zaid reads it twice. He folds it carefully and lays it aside. Something has shifted. The ink will not wait forever. Outside, night presses fully upon Baghdad. The sky above the dome of the House of Wisdom turns deep indigo, pierced by scattered stars like fine pinpricks in cloth. Lamps now flicker from distant balconies, casting long, thin reflections over the palace fountain. The Tigris is silent. Inside, Abu Zaid lights a second lamp. Its glow joins the first, two pools of gold among parchment shadows. He sets aside the scroll from earlier and draws forth another, blank, clean, untouched. This one will not speak of grain. This one is for what waits between the lines. He dips the kalam again. But this time, before the ink touches parchment, he closes his eyes, and listens, to the fountain outside, to the faint, uneven beating of his own heart, to the quiet question held between each breath. He begins to write, but not the vizier's words, not yet. The door creaked gently as Ibn Nasr stepped into the scriptorium, a long, low room tucked deep within the palace complex. A hush greeted him like an old friend, thicker here than in the courtyard, more ancient than the river breeze. It was the hush of ink not yet spilled, of quills resting on their sides like small, slender birds, of parchment waiting patiently to be turned into thought. The chamber, though plain in its architecture, radiated a quiet majesty. Its brick walls were washed in muted lime, their surfaces absorbing the cool torchlight like thirsty cloth. Oil lamps suspended from brass hooks flickered softly, casting golden halos that trembled against the stone. A wooden lattice stretched along the upper part of the outer wall, filtering the last blue shimmer of the sky through geometric shadows. Beneath it, the scent of warmed paper, old ink, and crushed cardamom lingered. Ibn Nasr paused at the threshold, as was his habit. His eyes moved slowly over the room, across the long wooden tables, some cluttered with scrolls and styluses, others bare and recently cleaned. One table bore a shallow bowl of fine sand used to blot wet ink. Beside it, a pair of inkwells stood like sentinels, one for black, the other for vermilion. He took his place near the far end of the chamber, where a wide, smooth board of cypress wood awaited his tools. The grain of it had been worn by years of steady wrists and careful hands. He touched the surface lightly with his fingers, tracing a knot in the wood the size of a lentil. It was his small ritual of beginning, acknowledging the material, the stillness, the page that was not yet marked. From a low shelf beneath the table, he drew out his writing kit, a lacquered box of pale walnut wood, its hinges tarnished with age. Inside, nestled on padded linen, lay his sharpened kalam, cut from Nile reed and trimmed to a fine point, a tiny knife for shaping it, a pot of ink sealed with a cork, and a small ceramic tile upon which he ground saffron and soot when mixing color. Each object had its place, and each was treated with the same reverence as a scholar might grant a rare text. The kalam, in particular, was his pride. He had trimmed it just the night before, after hours of deliberation. A kalam too thin would catch on parchment, too thick, and the letters would bleed. He tested its nib gently now against a scrap of wool paper, watching the thin line arc like a hair drawn across the moon. From across the room came a soft cough. Old Yusuf, bent over a scroll, his beard stained with ink in places where he had once fallen asleep mid-verse. Ibn Nasr smiled faintly, comforted by the sound. Yusuf had been writing in the caliph's court since the reign of Harun al-Rashid. He was said to have memorized the Quran 3 times over and could recite the legal titles of every governor since the year 200 of the Hijra. Now, he spent his days copying scholarly treatises on astronomy and his evenings nodding over hadith commentaries, muttering lines as he inked them. Ibn Nasr drew his own scroll from a clay jar nearby. It was a record from the Diwan al-Kharaj, the Bureau of Land Tax, requesting a full redrafting of revenue ledgers for several districts west of Wazit. Not glamorous, but important. The numbers and annotations would need to be exact. He unrolled the scroll slowly, careful not to wrinkle the fine papyrus, and weighed the end with a small alabaster stone, and so began the ritual of transcription. He dipped the kalam's nib into the black inkpot, tapping it gently on the rim to shake off excess droplets. The first stroke was always the name of God, Bismillah al-Rahman al-Rahim. He wrote it with practiced grace, letting each curve settle into its place like a bird alighting on water. The letters flowed beneath his hand like river reeds bending in sequence. Every letter in Arabic bore not just a sound, but a presence, a shape steeped in centuries of calligraphy. Minutes stretched into an hour. The chamber warmed slightly as more lamps were lit and the world outside dimmed. A servant passed by with a brass pitcher, offering mint water and cups of sweet tea steeped with clove. Ibn Nasr accepted one silently, setting it beside his inkstand. The steam drifted up, merging with the faint scent of parchment and resin. Around him, the other scribes worked with equal serenity. Their heads bent in quiet choreography, their hands gliding over paper like dancers across a stage no one watched. Some whispered verses under their breath. One murmured a line from Al-Mutanabi. Another hummed a Sufi tune, off-key but soft as a lullaby. For Ibn Nasr, this room was not just a workplace, it was a sanctuary of order in a world ruled by rumor and unrest. Here, things aligned. Letters had their proportion. Words had their place. The ink waited, patient and black, until summoned by the steady hand. He dipped his pen again. Outside, Baghdad's stars were rising. Chapter 2, Part 2, Inkwells and Judgments, 800 words. The quiet of the court archive was a lull broken only by the scratch of reed pens and the occasional cough of an old clerk. Ahmad moved slowly through the aisles of papyrus scrolls and parchment ledgers, the hem of his robe whispering against the stone floor. Lamplight flickered across the vaulted ceiling, where age-darkened beams met in quiet union, and the faint scent of cedarwood, used to repel insects, lingered in the dry air. It was in this hush that he found Master Taki seated behind the largest desk, deep in consultation with a bundle of complaints from a distant province. Master Taki, chief court scribe for civil petitions, wore his official sash draped diagonally over a robe of deep indigo. His beard, streaked with age, was combed and oiled, and his eyes remained sharp as tacks despite the hour. "You are late," Taki said without looking up, gesturing with his reed pen. "Sit. There is no shortage of ink tonight." Ahmad bowed slightly, then slipped into the wooden stool opposite him. Laid out before Taki were a series of scrolls, their ink only half dry, curling slightly at the corners like the leaves of parched plants. Taki handed Ahmad one without ceremony. Petition from Basra. Land dispute. The emir's cousin has overstepped his bounds, again. Ahmad read quickly, taking in the flowery opening salutation and the neat but anxious Arabic script. The petitioner claimed his irrigation canals were rerouted under orders from a powerful relative of the provincial governor, causing his date palms to wither. "He writes well," Ahmad murmured. "He does. enough to be noticed. See here, Taki pointed to the phrase Bihak al-Sharia, he invokes religious law, not just custom. That suggests a jurist advised him. Possibly the local Qadi. Ahmad nodded. He dipped his pen into the inkwell, giving it the smallest of taps against the rim to avoid a blot, and began drafting the court's response. As his hand moved, the script flowed with practiced grace. In the margins, Taki muttered comments, names, and legal codes. The document would go to a magistrate by morning. For the next 2 hours, Ahmad and Taki worked in tandem. They reviewed grievances, replied to decrees from other departments, and even prepared a final copy of a tax regulation to be reviewed by the vizier himself. A brass clepsydra dripped quietly beside them, marking the steady hours like the heartbeat of the caliphate. When they paused, it was not from fatigue, but from the arrival of another scribe, young Yahya, who had been posted to the palace only a few months prior. He carried with him a sealed scroll, tied with green silk. From the Dar al-Hikmah, Yahya whispered, his voice respectful. They ask for confirmation of this citation in the court's ruling. Something about Aristotle. Taki chuckled. Always Aristotle. Ahmad broke the seal, careful not to tear the delicate ribbon, and unrolled the scroll on the edge of the desk. The script within was Greek in origin, written in Arabic translation, and footnoted with the hand of a scholar who had clearly agonized over every verb. Taki glanced over his shoulder. They'll be arguing over whether it's episteme or techne until dawn, he said, rubbing his eyes. Just right, the ruling considers wisdom of both practical and philosophical nature. That should appease them. Ahmad grinned and made the note. From beyond the corridor, a sudden noise broke the stillness. One of the guards dropped a pike or scabbard. The clang echoed for a moment, then was swallowed by the thick walls again. Taki didn't flinch. No revolution tonight, he muttered. It was a small joke. But in the tense and intricate workings of the Abbasid court, small jokes mattered. They were the release valves for a world of measured ink and weighed words. Ahmad glanced at the lamp between them, its light now steady and golden. Around them, the night deepened, but the work continued. A tray arrived silently at some point, figs, almonds, honeyed cakes, and a ceramic jug of rosewater. Taki took a single fig and waved Ahmad toward the rest. You'll need the sugar, he said. You're meeting with the historian next, aren't you? Ahmad nodded. He never stops talking. Taki offered the closest thing he had to a smile, a crinkle at the corners of his eyes. As Ahmad gathered the scrolls and the ink-stained cloth he used to clean his pen, he felt a quiet satisfaction. This was no audience with the caliph, no evening banquet, no romantic midnight tryst, but it was the pulse of an empire, and he was part of it, word by deliberate word. The inkwell sits like a sentinel at the edge of the desk, glinting faintly in the lamp's light. Murshid lifts his reed pen and lets the fine tip hover just above the parchment's breathless stillness. His fingers, ink-smudged and steady, pause for the briefest of heartbeats. He breathes. Then writes. Letter by letter, word by word, the fluidity of Arabic script blossoms across the page, curves and dots dancing with rhythm and reverence. The ink glides, drying swiftly on the parchment's surface. Each stroke is deliberate, not rushed, a motion born of countless hours spent in quiet halls just like this one. Outside, Baghdad's night deepens, but within these palace walls, time stretches like a silken thread. The wind sighs softly against the wooden shutters. Somewhere far down the corridor, a servant's sandals whisper against stone, then fade. Murshid does not look up. He is lost in the weaving of a court petition, a land dispute between two aging brothers, farmers from Kufa. Their names, their grievances, their lineage and witnesses, all unfurl beneath his pen. A small ceramic oil lamp flickers beside him. The flame is steady, protected behind a horn window that casts an amber glow. Its light brushes across stacks of old records, tied with string and faded by decades of dust and sun. The scent of warm oil and aged paper fills the air. From a high shelf, a gecko skitters across the timber, pausing to watch the motion of the pen below. Murshid glances up, offers a soft smile, and returns to his work. Even the smallest observer, he thinks, deserves acknowledgement. At his elbow, a shallow bowl of rosewater sits, fragrant and cool. He dips his fingers in occasionally, dabbing at his brow, cleansing ink from his fingertips. In the stillness, even the act of rinsing one's hand becomes sacred, a ritual between thoughts. Beneath the bowl lies a folded linen cloth, embroidered faintly with his mother's hand, a keepsake from her village near Basra. The hours pass with little fanfare. Murshid's only companion is the subtle pulse of the court's stillness. Every now and then, he pauses to stretch, rolling his shoulders beneath his light wool cloak, or to refill the ink from a stoppered vial carved with lapis inlay. He inspects the nib of his calum, trims it with a small penknife, and tests it against the margins of old parchment. Smooth. Ready. Again, he writes. Not all the scrolls on his desk belong to others. Tucked among the bureaucratic petitions and royal summaries is a small parchment of his own, a story drafted in the quiet hours between assignments. He glances at it now. It tells of a falconer's daughter and a caravan that vanishes in the Rub al-Khali. No one in the court knows he writes fiction. It is a secret he guards as one might guard a prayer. A soft knock sounds at the door. Murshid's hand stills. The flame flutters. Then a familiar voice, Nazim, the steward, calling gently through the wood, tea, and dates, if you'll have them. Murshid opens the door with a smile of gratitude. Nazim enters with a copper tray, sweet black tea steeped in cardamom, a small bowl of dates stuffed with almonds, and a folded note. He sets it down without a word, bows slightly, and leaves. Murshid breaks his focus only long enough to savor the tea's warmth and bite into a single date. The flavor is rich, deeply sweet. He turns to the note. The calligraphy is elegant and fine. He knows the hand immediately, the caliph's chief vizier. A request for transcription, a fragment of poetry to be copied and illuminated by dawn. He exhales through his nose and leans back, sipping slowly. The work never truly ends, but it shifts in color and pace. A petition gives way to verse. A day's toil yields to night's quiet meditations. The stars beyond the shutters are invisible, hidden by the lantern's reflection. But Murshid knows they are there, scattered across the black dome above the caliph's city. He imagines the Tigris shimmering in the moonlight, the barges at rest, and a boy dreaming in a reed-woven bed by the riverside. He returns to his desk. The new parchment awaits. Beside it, a tiny bottle of indigo ink, a rare pigment meant only for poetry. The scribe's steps guided him into a quiet chamber tucked away at the rear of the diwan, where the lattice window cast speckled patterns across the tiled floor. This space, smaller than the central hall, was no less important. It was a repository of reference scrolls and bindings, a chamber where decisions waited not to be made, but to be remembered. He drew in a breath, scented faintly with dust, rosewater, and the faintest residue of lamp oil. On the low shelves were codices and scrolls arranged by function, edicts of succession, records of tax collection, descriptions of lands and governors, translations of treaties from distant courts. Some had been copied by the scribe's own hand many years ago. Others bore the lettering of colleagues now gone, their steady hands stilled by age or illness. There was a solemn hush to the room, not of abandonment, but of respect. He laid his tools on a small wooden table by the wall, an inkwell with a domed copper lid, his worn callum knife, and a folded piece of linen to catch ink blots. In the quiet, he could hear the lattice's wooden fretwork groaning gently in the night breeze, and beyond it, the faint lapping of the Tigris against the banks. The hum of Baghdad was distant now, as if the city itself paused to grant the scribe time. From a narrow chest, he withdrew the scroll he had come for, a record of correspondence between the caliph's court and the Armenian governorates, written some 20 winters ago. The parchment was yellowed at the edges, its seals slightly cracked, but the ink remained firm. He spread it on the table with reverent hands and lit a second oil lamp to better illuminate the calligraphy. Outside, voices drifted up from the courtyard below. A young servant was tending to a mule, murmuring softly as he adjusted the harness. The scribe listened, not as a spy, but as a witness to the rhythm of others' lives. This was the gift of the night scribe, the ability to exist in stillness, to observe rather than intrude, to preserve without altering. With his callum trimmed and ink fresh, he began transcribing the older letter. His own hand was steadier than the original, yet he matched the older script's cadence, the height of its flourishes, the spacing of its breath. In doing so, he honored the unknown scribe before him, not replacing their work, but letting it live again. As he copied, he paused often, not from fatigue, but from the need to dwell in the meaning of the words. The language was formal and ornate, invoking the names of rivers and mountains, of ancestral claims and ancient friendships. It spoke of a world both distant and still present in the ink. A gentle knock came at the wooden doorframe. He turned to find a young apprentice, barely more than a boy, carrying a small dish of dried figs and a brass cup of water. The boy entered hesitantly, bowing slightly before placing the offering beside the scribe's tools. "Would you like a cushion, Ustad?" the boy asked softly, careful not to disturb the silence that wrapped the chamber. The scribe shook his head, smiling. "No, thank you. But sit, if you like. Watch." The boy hesitated, then lowered himself to the cool floor beside the table. His eyes followed every movement, the dip of the reed into the ink, the slight twist of the wrist, the moment of stillness before a stroke was drawn. He was not ready yet to write, but his gaze was already sharpening. Outside the lattice, the moon climbed higher. The patterns it cast now stretched across the entire chamber, climbing the shelves like vines of silver light. The scribe reached for the next portion of the scroll. In the corner of the parchment, a note had been left in red ink, an annotation from the original scribe, correcting a phrase. He copied that too, faithfully, red ink over red, as if linking hands across the years. Time in the chamber passed like breath, unnoticed, but deeply felt. And in that moment, beneath the latticed window with the boy beside him and the moon above, the scribe felt not alone but folded gently into the lineage of those who served with ink, not for glory, but for memory. The light of the candle had shortened once more, a waxen tower now leaning, its flame trembling with each breath of air that slipped through the mashrabiyah screen. The last notes of the muezzin's call had long since melted into the stillness, leaving the scriptorium in a hush deeper than silence. It was here, in this final hour before midnight, that the act of copying took on its truest form, not a task of labor, but of reverence. The scribe's brush dipped silently into the inkpot, its tip laden with black that shimmered faintly like the wing of a crow. He returned to the thick sheet of parchment and drew the next letter, a fluid sin, then a deliberate ra, each stroke unfurling like the breath of the reed itself. The script, a flowing Naskh hand, curved in graceful arcs, the letters speaking with silent dignity. Around him, the chamber was cloaked in still activity. Mahmud, the junior copyist, had fallen into a slow rhythm at the far end of the bench, his eyes half-lidded but steady. To his side, a pile of unbound folios rested, weighed down by a smooth piece of green marble, its cool sheen catching the last of the light. The faint scent of old parchment and olive oil drifted through the air, mingling with the smokeless perfume of a single sandalwood stick burning quietly in a corner brazier. Above them, the painted ceiling was lost in shadow, but the stars outside remained visible through the narrow slats of the wooden lattice. The sounds of Baghdad had softened. The splash of oars from a passing boat on the Tigris echoed like a lullaby. Somewhere far off, a gate creaked shut. The palace had fallen into rest, all but the scribes. The next passage was a royal decree. The scribe paused, lifting his gaze as if to listen again to the voice that had spoken it, long before. His quill hovered above the page. The names of viziers, the weight of taxes, the division of grain, these were not mere words but matters that tilted lives. And yet, as he began to write, each letter felt like an act of obedience, not only to the caliph but to the rhythm of the universe itself, the eternal duty to bear witness. To his right lay a small clay tablet, rubbed smooth by years of note-taking, the edges stained with the oil of hands. On it were marks, sketches, tiny outlines of seals and signatures the scribe had traced in idle moments. Beneath it, a folded cloth bore the embroidered symbol of the House of Wisdom, a stylized lantern surrounded by curling vines, barely visible now in the dim light. Mahmud stirred, rubbing his temples, then reaching for the fig paste that had been placed on a ceramic dish earlier in the night. The scribe offered no words. These hours did not invite conversation. They were for inner thoughts, for memory, for the gentle surrender to routine. He allowed his hand to rest, flexing his fingers slowly. Ink left faint ghosts upon the pads of his fingertips. Then, as though summoned by thought alone, came the soft patter of footsteps, not hurried, not tentative, but measured. A servant entered silently bearing a fresh candle and a cup of warm milk steeped with cardamom. His eyes lowered, he replaced the dwindling light and bowed, vanishing once more into the corridor. The milk was untouched for a while. The scribe watched the tiny ripples on its surface, like wind on the Tigris. Time felt disjointed now. The boundaries of hour and minute had dissolved. What remained was rhythm, the dipping of the pen, the rise of the letters, the careful blotting of the ink, the slow turning of the folio. Beyond the palace walls, Baghdad dreamed beneath its star-draped sky, but within these chambers, a different dream was being woven, one of script and silence. He turned to a blank page, ran his hand over its surface. It was cool, almost tender, like the skin of a newborn. This, too, would one day hold the words of kings, the verses of poets, the lineage of caliphs. But for now, it waited, pure, receptive, full of promise. With a breath that felt older than his own body, he began again. The court was never fully silent, not even at night. Though the grand audience chamber had been emptied of its midday crowds, and the high-backed seats of the viziers and judges stood unoccupied, a murmur still hung in the air, like the echo of thoughts yet to be spoken. Fadl walked slowly beneath the arches of the eastern colonnade, his inkwell swinging gently in his hand. The marble beneath his sandals was cool, touched by the air that drifted down from the Tigris. Above, a lattice of shadow played across the ceiling, patterns cast by the wooden mashrabiyah panels, finely carved like the lines of a delicate manuscript. Candlelight flickered behind some of them, hinting at scholars who still worked behind their wooden screens, reading by oil lamp deep into the night. He paused at the fountain at the center of the hallway. Though modest in design, the water sang as it fell over its stone edges, and that gentle music accompanied the breath of the palace. He dipped his fingers into the water, not to wash, but simply to feel the coolness, the motion, the pulse of the place. Here in the scribe's quarter of the palace, it was customary for workers to return before the second third of the night began. Night-time was when certain decrees were prepared, when diplomatic letters were carefully inked under lantern light, or when the caliph might call unexpectedly for a document to be read aloud to him in private. Tonight, however, things were quiet. Fadl noted this with both relief and unease. Quiet often meant calm, but in the court, it could also mean that something stirred beneath the surface, like a wind gathering beyond the dunes. He passed a pair of night guards seated cross-legged on a woven mat. One polished a scimitar with a rag, humming softly, the other dozed with his head against the wall. They offered him a nod as he passed, their presence a silent reassurance that the great halls remained watched over even as the city's sleep deepened. A rustle behind a curtain caught his ear. He turned his head slightly and glimpsed a kitchen boy slipping through with a tray of dates and rosewater. Even now, the caliph's attendants were on call, ever prepared in case the sovereign desired refreshment or a sudden conversation with one of his astronomers or poets. Fadl stepped quietly into the main hallway leading to the Diwan al-Tarjama, the Bureau of Translation. Though the bureau itself would be closed until morning, its corridor was lined with tiled murals, showing philosophers and mathematicians seated with open scrolls in lap, stars painted in gold above them. He lingered there, his fingertips lightly tracing the edge of one painted scroll. These were the masters whose knowledge the Abbasid court had gathered from the farthest reaches of the known world: Greek, Persian, Indian, Syriac, now rendered into Arabic script with patient hands like his own. Somewhere behind a closed door, he heard the sound of recitation. A soft voice, male, repeating lines of poetry, probably a young court reader practicing his verses before presenting them to the vizier. It was a voice with rhythm, lilting upward at each line's end. Fadl smiled faintly, reminded of the rhythm his own hand followed when inscribing the verses of Al-Mutanabi or the letters of the Hadith. At last, he arrived at the doorway of the smaller record room, his final task for the evening. Within, shelves stretched high with bound ledgers, scrolls tied in ribbon, and slips of parchment marked with charcoal. A brass oil lamp hung from the ceiling, barely swaying, casting the room in a warm ochre glow. He lit the wick of his own lamp and placed it on the table at the far end. The smell of ink and parchment wrapped around him like an old cloak. There was comfort in it, in the order of things, this place where words waited, caught like fireflies on pages, held in stasis until called forth again. Tonight, he was to update the court ledger, a record of trade goods from Basra, their taxes recorded, their path through the city mapped in fine script. It was not glorious work. There were no verses to inscribe, no decrees of great wisdom. But the ledgers mattered. The economy ran on them. Merchants were granted passage because of their accuracy. Arguments were settled by their entries. He drew out the folio, its leather cover smooth from many years of touch. Sitting cross-legged on the woven mat, he opened to the correct page. He uncapped the inkwell, dipped his pen, and waited. There was a moment, always, that passed before the first letter. A breath. The calm before ink became meaning, and then he began. The lantern's glow shifts gently with the breeze from the mashrabiyah window, its carved wooden lattice casting delicate shadows across the floor. The scribe, still cloaked in the soft hush of the hour, runs a careful thumb over the end of his newly trimmed calum. The fine reed quivers slightly, as though eager to return to the page. He dips it again into the inkwell, dark as tamarind paste, thick as memory, and presses it gently to the paper. The ink does not blot or spatter. It flows. Letters emerge with grace, each loop and stroke gliding into place, as if summoned by quiet invocation. Outside the quiet hall, the sounds of the city remain muffled, a distant hoot of a night owl, the occasional clip of a donkey's hoof on stone, and somewhere far off, a song half sung by a drunkard lost in reverie. But inside, there is only the soft rasp of reed on paper and the rhythmic scratch that fills the chamber like incense. The scribe pauses, exhaling slowly through his nose. His hand rests atop the parchment as his eyes trace the fresh lines. He is not simply transcribing, he is curating a legacy of poets, caliphs, and travelers whose words will journey beyond this room, perhaps beyond this age. In this particular passage, the scribe copies a tale from the court of Harun al-Rashid, the caliph of a generation past. The story unfolds like a soft breeze, its heroes riding under starlight, its disputes solved by riddles and cups of wine. The words sing of gardens that never wither, of silks soaked in rosewater, of parrots that recite the Quran with more fluency than a scholar. But it is not the fantastical that draws the scribe in, it is the cadence, the rise and fall of a sentence that knows when to dance and when to rest. He shifts his posture slightly. A wooden triangle holds the paper at a slant, angled just enough to relieve his neck. His hand, speckled with old ink stains and softened by years of repetition, continues its slow and deliberate movement. Each line is aligned with red guide marks made earlier, thin as a whisper. The discipline of it all feels devotional, like prayer, but one shaped not by spoken verses, but by the dance of ink. Behind him, shelves rise in dusty rows, each one cradling scrolls and folded folios tied with dyed cords. Some are receipts from merchants in Basra, others letters between viziers, still others are copies of long-forgotten poems meant for the caliph's ear. The scribe has touched them all. Some he copied in youth, his hand then less steady but no less devoted. Others he only read, treating each phrase as one might a pomegranate seed, biting through the skin to savor what lay beneath. The oil in the lamp gutters slightly. He sets down his calum and carefully trims the wick. The light flares briefly, then returns to its amber hush. On the table, a small wooden box contains tools of the trade, spare reeds, a burnishing stone, a penknife, and a pot of dried ink. Beside it rests a ceramic dish of quince slices, dusted with crushed coriander. He takes one in silence, chewing slowly as his eyes scan the last line. On the far wall hangs a single painted tile, blue with white calligraphy, "In patience, there is beauty." It is a phrase he copied 1,000 times in his apprenticeship. Its letters curve like palm fronds in a desert wind. Even now, he feels its truth in his bones. Minutes pass. Or perhaps longer. The scribe has long lost his sense of measured time. He moves again, drawing fresh parchment closer. The old folio is set aside with reverence, pressed under a small brass weight shaped like a lion. He brushes a fine cloth over the blank surface, smoothing away dust. Then, without ceremony, he begins again. Dips. Taps. Writes. The silence welcomes the return of ink. The moon has crept higher now, its soft light glinting through the wooden lattice like brushed silver on linen. Inside the scribe's chamber, the stillness deepens. The hum of the city has settled to a faint murmur, like the sea heard from far across the dunes. The scribe leans forward slightly, letting the weight of his body rest gently into the wooden writing stand. His fingers, steady with years of quiet repetition, hold the reed pen poised above the page. But he does not write just yet. He listens, not to voices, there are none in the silent room, but to rhythm. To breath. To the unseen cadence of the words he is about to inscribe. Before him lies a poem, commissioned for the caliph's personal anthology. The original is from a famed poet now long dead, a man said to have composed verses so finely tuned that even the reeds along the Tigris swayed when they were read aloud. The scribe has already copied the main body of the poem in stately Naskh script. But now, he prepares to add a note in the margin, a brief commentary, requested by the vizier himself, explaining a phrase about rose gardens in winter. These margin notes, small, almost whisper-like, are among the scribe's favorite duties. They are private thoughts in the vast chamber of official words. tiny echoes, carved beside the towering voices of poets and kings. He trims the nib of his reed ever so slightly, sharpening the angle for the delicate, slanting script used in commentary. The shavings fall soundlessly onto a folded scrap of linen, to be swept away at dawn. And then he writes. His commentary is brief, only a few lines, but each word is chosen as carefully as spices in a physician's blend. He explains that the poet likely refers not to literal roses, but to the imagined ones of paradise, hinted at in a hadith. A metaphor drawn with grace, neither too clear nor too vague. He adds a second note, lightly phrased, on how the winter garden is often a symbol of patience rewarded, of life beneath stillness. His script here is more fluid than in the main text, less rigid. He allows his hand to breathe. Each mark made in this moment, outside the rigid formality of the main script, feels like a step down a quiet side street, away from the grand avenues of the court. When he finishes the note, he lifts the reed and rests it across the inkwell's rim. The flickering light catches on the curve of his inkstone, polished smooth by years of rubbing. A single drop of ink clings to the tip of the pen, trembling. The scribe sets it down and leans back. His eyes wander to the tall wooden cabinet in the corner, its doors closed now, but behind them sit volumes of stories, law texts, riddles, and treatises on the stars. Some he has copied himself, others merely handled. Each bears his care, if not his hand. The cabinet, in a way, is as much a library as the great halls of Dar al-Hikmah. But here, there is no whisper of politics, no echo of command, only the soft presence of learning, nestled in olive wood. He reaches for a cloth to wipe his fingers. Though he is not stained with ink, it is habit, part of the ritual. Like a priest washing hands after a blessing, his gaze shifts again, to a small scrap of parchment resting near the lamp. It holds a child's writing, uneven, the letters wide and eager. His nephew's, from last week's visit. The boy, no more than 7, had insisted on writing his name in the style of the caliph. The scribe let him try, and the result now lies preserved like a talisman, a reminder that even the most elegant calligrapher was once uncertain with a pen. He smiles faintly at the memory. Then, reaching again for his reed, he returns to the main folio. The next stanza awaits. It begins with a description of a dawn sky above Samara, pink and gold like opened pomegranate. He reads the line once silently, then again aloud, under his breath. The syllables settle like balm on the air, and once again, he writes. Ink glides. Words arrive. Silence hums. Outside, a palm frond rustles in the breeze, brushing the stone wall in rhythm. And in the margins of the world, the scribe continues his quiet work. The inkwell had not moved, nor had the candle. But the room felt changed. The scribe leaned back, careful not to creak the low wooden bench beneath him. His hands, ink-stained and dry at the fingertips, rested quietly on his lap. For a moment, he allowed himself to watch the flame flicker without purpose. The court had grown hushed. Behind the heavy wooden doors, the world of advisors and ministers slowed like a spinning wheel coming to rest. Through the tall arched window, slivers of the outside night crept in, distant lanterns bobbing across the Tigris, the hush of river trade winding down. The moon hung quietly, too thin to light the streets below. Its pale presence lent a gentle glow to the edges of everything, the glass jars on the wall shelf, the rolled scrolls tucked in their nooks, the copper ink knife resting flat. In that stillness, the scribe picked up a cloth and gently wiped the nib of his reed pen. It was an ordinary act, performed perhaps hundreds of times a week, but in this moment, it felt ceremonious. A kind of benediction. The slowing of the heart. The acknowledgement of breath. The oil in the lamp hissed faintly as a thread of the wick darkened. A moth, drawn to warmth, danced and vanished in a soft eddy of air near the wall. From somewhere nearby, a servant's footfall passed and faded. Then silence returned. He allowed his mind to wander briefly, just at the edges. Not far. Just to the image of his mother's terrace garden when he was a child. Jasmine climbing over clay pots. The hum of bees over crushed mint. A page he once dried in the sun and watched curl like a leaf. Not memories with meaning, only shape. Only scent and shade, but he had not forgotten the ink. It waited on the page before him, glistening, half-written, a sentence paused mid-breath. Arabic script, still damp, unfurled like river reeds under moonlight, curling elegantly from left to right. He had become so familiar with the shapes that he no longer read them as letters. They were gestures. Movements. Tiny dances done by his fingers across parchment. He reached for the paperweight, a smooth stone carved with a lion motif, and gently set it atop a finished page to keep it from curling in the heat. The lion stared up at him, frozen mid-roar, though dulled by generations of use. Like all things in this room, it served not only purpose but memory. Across the chamber, the wooden cupboard stood ajar. Inside, sealed letters rested like sleeping birds, wrapped in silk twine, each destined for some far-off part of the caliphate. Syria. Persia. The Maghrib. Some letters held commands, others bore blessings or poems. He never read them beyond their formatting, never knew their final reception. He simply folded and sealed and copied and wrote. A poet might say his job lacked passion. But the scribe knew otherwise. There was intimacy in transcription. In the hush between syllables. In carrying another's thought, one quill stroke at a time, across the fragile threshold of paper. He stood slowly, letting his legs stretch from hours of stillness. The rug underfoot, woven in kufa, was soft from years of wear, its patterns worn smooth where he paced in thought. He stepped toward the corner table and poured a little water into a brass bowl, rinsing the ink from his fingers. He looked up. The night had deepened. It no longer whispered through the shutters, it simply existed. Soft, pressing, vast. In this suspended time, he was neither part of the court nor apart from it. He was something in between. A vessel. A whisperer of others' words, and so he sat again. Slowly. Quietly. The ink had waited. And the page had not forgotten him. The document was nearly finished. Just one paragraph remained, and yet the scribe hesitated, his pen suspended above the parchment like a heron over still water. The sentence waited patiently for its final shape, the ink gathering in the hollow of the reed pen. It was a letter of judgment. A matter concerning land inheritance near Basra, written on behalf of the caliph and bound for a governor 2 weeks' ride away. To most, it was just administrative work, lines of precise language designed to clarify, enforce, and conclude. But to the scribe, it was something else. Words had weight. Especially these. He lowered the pen and began to write once more, shaping each character with careful authority, each dot placed with the deliberateness of a closing gate. The phrase was one he had copied countless times, by the command of the commander of the faithful, so it is decreed, but still he moved slowly, the way a muezzin prepares his breath before the call to prayer. Behind him, a draught stirred the candle flame. The doors to the side chamber opened gently with a low wooden groan, and a familiar figure entered, Sakr, a senior court steward in dark robes, moving like a shadow. He was neither loud nor impatient, but his presence carried the hum of higher purpose. The kind of person who always seemed to know when a letter was almost done. "You are at the end of it?" Sakr asked quietly, standing just within the doorway. The scribe did not turn. He nodded once, finishing the last word with a subtle curl of the pen. Then he placed the sheet carefully in the tray of drying sand, lifting it again moments later to shake the grains off in a practiced motion. The ink shimmered a deep brown-black, no longer wet, but still alive. Sacker stepped closer and picked up the sheet without comment. His eyes scanned it with the practiced glance of someone who had seen thousands of such documents. Yet he took a moment longer than usual, nodding slightly before folding the page and placing it into a long envelope of oiled paper. "It will leave with the next writer," he murmured. Before dawn, the scribe gave a soft hum of acknowledgement. Neither man spoke of the contents. That was not their custom. It was understood that the ink bore its own authority, one that needed no reiteration. Still, Sacker lingered for a moment, his eyes falling on the work table, the open inkwell, the drying parchment, the lion-shaped paperweight, the slowly flickering candle. "You've not rested?" he asked, almost gently. The scribe allowed a faint smile to form. "The night is quieter than rest." Sacker nodded again, as if this confirmed something he already believed. Then he turned and left the room without a sound. Once more alone, the scribe stood and began to clean his tools. He washed the nib in the ceramic dish, wiped it dry with a piece of soft wool, and capped the inkwell. Each item found its place again, as it always did. The fire in the brazier had faded to embers, its red light a subtle heartbeat in the room's corner. Outside, the faintest light was beginning to show above the eastern walls, barely a hue, just a cooling of stars. Another night, almost behind him. He reached for the wooden shutter and opened it gently. The air that entered was cool, carrying the scent of river reeds and faraway kitchens beginning to stir. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing it in. Baghdad was awakening, but in the scriptorium, time held stillness a little longer. Here, the night had not yet fully passed. It clung like perfume to the drapes, like smoke to a robe, like ink to the memory of parchment. The scribe leaned one last time over his desk and blew out the candle. The thin trail of smoke curled upward, vanishing into the rafters. In that breath of darkness, he heard the city begin again, hoofbeats in the court, a shouted greeting from the gate, the rattle of a wooden cart beyond the wall. His work was finished. For now, but ink, like thought, never truly rests. It only waits. The first call to prayer drifted over the tiled rooftops of Baghdad like a silk veil on the morning wind. It came not as a command, but as a beckoning, a slow unfolding of sound that rose and fell in gentle waves. From a distant minaret, the muezzin's voice wove through the quiet streets, drawing birds from their nests and stirring the river's slow breath. The sky above the round city softened from indigo to pearl, and shadows slipped behind pillars and domes. The scribe stood at his small window, his hands clasped behind his back. He had not gone to his sleeping mat, though the night had long since ended. Instead, he watched the rooftops warm in hue, clay tiles kissed by the first light, walls turning the color of warm bread. Below, the alleyways of the administrative quarter remained hushed. But he could sense movement beginning in the layers of the city, a servant lighting a brazier in the kitchens, a guard loosening his shoulders after a long watch, a scholar scratching flint to rekindle the coals of his study lamp. Dawn in Baghdad was never hurried. It unfolded like script across a page, patient and deliberate. The scribe returned to his desk and poured a shallow cup of water. He drank slowly, relishing the faint mineral taste from the city's wells. A single date rested on a small dish beside it, his modest breaking of the night's fast. He bit into it and let the sweetness coat his tongue. It was a simple offering to the morning, but it was enough. From somewhere beyond the walls of the palace compound, a rooster gave a lazy crow. Then another. As if the birds, too, had overslept slightly, unwilling to rise too soon. He sat once more, though he would not write yet. Instead, He drew a folded sheet of parchment from a compartment beneath the desk, thicker than usual, with a worn crease along one edge. It was a letter he had copied months ago, sent from a poet stationed in Samarra to his brother in Baghdad. Though personal letters rarely passed through his hands anymore, this one had stayed with him. The original had long been delivered, but the scribe had made a second version for reasons he never explained to anyone, not even himself. He opened it now and read in silence. "Brother, though the Tigris runs swift here and the air is clear, I find myself longing for the cadence of the markets in Baghdad, and the way the sun slips across the tiles at midday. I miss the scent of warm olives and the sound of the call to prayer echoing through the spice quarter." The scribe paused. He could nearly hear those echoes now, faint but returning, layered behind the breath of the breeze that passed through the open window. This city was not merely home. It was memory made stone, etched in brick and dome, in scroll and calligraphy, in the echo of every morning's call. He folded the letter once more and returned it to its drawer, gently sliding the panel shut. Outside, the light had changed again. Now it gilded the tops of the ziggurats and minarets, throwing long soft shadows that pooled at their feet. The pigeons had taken to the air in slow, whirling dances, their wings catching hints of gold as they passed the light. Footsteps now stirred in the hallway beyond the scribe's chamber. Not hurried, not loud, just the measured tread of those whose day was about to begin, junior scribes bringing fresh parchment, stewards carrying bundles of sealed correspondence, scholars wiping the dust from tablets and setting out their inks. A knock came, a soft one. "Enter," the scribe said, his voice calm and low. A young apprentice peeked in, cradling a leather pouch against his chest. His eyes were still a bit puffy with sleep, but he offered a respectful nod before stepping inside. "The messages from the eastern gate, master." 3 scrolls and a sealed slip from the observatory. The scribe nodded. "Place them there," he said, gesturing to the side table. "And bring hot water, if it is ready." The apprentice obeyed, careful not to disturb the careful arrangement of tools on the main desk. The city had fully awakened now. And so had the work. But in this quiet beginning, beneath the murmured greetings and the rising warmth of day, the scribe felt a lingering stillness, an aftertaste of night, like a fading verse. And he let it rest there for a moment longer, as the ink waited once more. Within the quiet folds of the Diwan al-Insha, time seemed not to pass but to curl softly, like steam rising from a bowl of jasmine tea left near an open window. Ishaq's lamp flickered with renewed strength after a cautious tending. A small clay bottle of fine olive oil, carefully poured from the reserves, nourished its flame. It gave off a warmth that did not fight the cold but rather made peace with it, a glow rather than a blaze. Beside him, ink continued to sleep in its shallow bowl, unmoved until summoned. The fine reed pen, its tip whittled again during a moment of stillness, rested across a folded cloth, as if in prayer. Outside the small stained window, the courtyard of the Beit al-Hikmah had darkened. But within, in the hallways Ishaq had once walked as a young apprentice, flickers of torchlight echoed and receded like thoughts half remembered. One could still hear footsteps on distant tiles. The moon had begun to rise above the Tigris, reflected in a long vertical slit of glass across the northern wall, a silver shard caught between 2 worlds. Ishaq leaned forward, now tracing carefully the margin of a decree. A single line of red pigment, cinnabar mixed with gum arabic, guided the eye like the borders of a Persian carpet. The page was not a page until it held direction, and the red told the reader where to begin, how to follow, when to rest. He paused to take a fig from the wooden bowl on his side table. Its skin was wrinkled and soft, its sweetness remained untouched by the night's coolness. He chewed slowly, letting the tiny seeds crunch like grains of sand. Then, with fingers wiped on a square of flax cloth, he returned to his script. Each letter he shaped emerged like a tiny architecture, arches and towers of ink. The Arabic script was not merely language but geometry, a mapping of thought into form. He often wondered, late at night, if perhaps the divine saw in calligraphy a kind of worship, as others might see in prayer or silence. In a corner of the scriptorium, the wind nudged a hanging scroll. It rustled faintly, a whisper of old paper, faded silk. Ishaq did not look up. He had long grown used to such sounds. Buildings, like people, moved in their own ways after dark. A passing slave boy with a copper jug refilled his ceramic cup with rosewater. The boy said nothing, only bowed slightly, eyes lowered. Ishaq returned a small nod, and then let the faint floral aroma fill his nose. The drink cooled his throat, sharpening his attention. Now the night deepened. On the manuscript table before him lay an unfinished letter to the governor of Wazit. Its lines still needed polishing. The opening was too cold, he thought. The salutation lacked flourish. And in Baghdad, a city of poets, even bureaucracy needed elegance. He dipped his pen once more and tried a second phrasing, longer, more embroidered, something with a reference to the river's generosity and the moon's soft impartiality. His pen glided in small deliberate motions. Here was the moment when ink began to speak. Behind him, shadows gathered in the high corners of the room. They curled like forgotten curtains. On the wall above, a niche filled with bound scrolls seemed to breathe. In such a room, one might feel that words themselves lived, and that when the scribes went home, the books whispered to one another in the dark. A soft scratching came from near the tiled floor. A small house gecko had emerged, its belly close to the stone, eyes flickering toward the lamplight. It froze a moment, then dashed along the edge of the wall and disappeared beneath a basket of rags. Ishaq smiled, slightly. The only other living creature who understood this hour, perhaps. When he looked again at the page, his hand resumed its slow, steady glide. Ink and silence had become one, and the room itself seemed to hush in reverence. The hours passed unnoticed by the stars. Above the court buildings, the moon had taken its place, high and clear, like a silver dirham held aloft. The narrow windows of the Diwan al-Insha offered only a sliver of its glow, yet it was enough. Ishaq no longer needed to see the moon to feel its presence. It breathed through the air, softened the ink, cooled the tiles beneath his feet. A distant call to prayer, from some lonely minaret beyond the walls, stirred the stillness. It was not time for far, not yet, but perhaps a muezzin preparing his throat, or a night guard humming to himself in the tower. The melody rolled over the rooftops and fell away like a piece of silk. Ishaq stretched his hand, stiff from hours of posture and precision. The muscles along his shoulder ached gently, in the way a musician's might after a long recital. He set down the reed pen once more and folded his hands in his lap, letting his eyes rest on the space just beyond the manuscript. The small lamp beside him gave off a gentle hiss. The wick, now low, danced beneath the meniscus of oil. He would need to trim it soon, but not yet. There was time still for quiet before returning to labor. To his right, a narrow wooden shelf bore a modest but treasured stack of scrolls and bound folios, copies of legal treatises, poetry, and correspondence with distant provinces. One bore the seal of the caliph himself, pressed in wax and still faintly fragrant with the ambergris that marked official dispatches from the palace. Ishaq had copied it with trembling hands weeks ago, but the scent still clung to the parchment like memory. He rose quietly and walked to the opposite wall, where an ancient cedar cabinet stood, its hinges creaked with the familiarity of a friend. Inside it, beneath carefully folded cloths, lay the scriptorium's archive, documents whose authors had died long ago, their names reduced to seals and flourishes. Ishaq unwrapped one such letter, a dispatch from 30 winters past, written during the famine in Khorasan. The script was narrow and angled, with a dryness that spoke of cold fingers and tight breath. The ink had faded to a warm brown, like the edge of an almond. Still, the words endured. He brought the scroll to the light, not to read it for purpose, but for presence. His fingers moved over the curves of the calligraphy as one might follow the ribs of a lute. This, too, was a kind of prayer, to witness the ink of those who came before, to let it speak once more, even silently. Outside, a dog barked once, then twice. A cart-wheel creaked. Somewhere, perhaps near the marketplace, an oven was being stoked, the baker's paddle stirring coals. The city of Baghdad had not fallen asleep, it had only slowed, hushed its breath beneath layers of woven time. Returning to his seat, Ishaq laid the old scroll beside his own fresh work. The contrast was striking, brown and brittle beside bold and black, lines aged into their paper like the wrinkling of skin. Yet the kinship between the two was unmistakable. Both born of ink and patience. Both the result of unseen hours. He picked up his pen again. Now came the colophon, the line that closed the document. It was not merely a name, but a signature of presence, written humbly by Ishaq ibn Rafi, servant of the pen, in the diwan of His Majesty, may Allah extend his shadow. It must be perfect. Not grand, but whole. A final breath placed in ink. He drew the last letter with a slowness that felt like gratitude. Then, gently, he tapped the end of the pen against the edge of the inkstone, wiped its tip on the cloth, and laid it to rest once more. The page sat before him, finished. He did not roll it yet. The ink must dry fully before being sealed. Instead, he covered it with a thin gauze of linen, to guard it from dust and breeze, and leaned back into the stillness once more. From the far corner, the gecko returned, this time slower, bold in its exploration. Ishaq watched it without moving. It paused beneath the table, blinked twice, then vanished again beneath a stack of papyrus rolls. Somewhere outside, the first hint of light had begun to draw a line behind the rooftops. Not sunrise, not yet, but a lifting of black into deep navy. Ishaq could feel it before he saw it. The night was no longer at its deepest, it was in retreat. But still, for now, the ink remained wet, the lamp remained lit, and the breath of the archive was warm. A hush settled over the chamber as the senior scribe entered, a man of delicate age, with eyes like worn glass and a bearing that suggested decades of ink and observation. He moved without haste, without flourish, but every head lifted slightly when he passed. His presence was not commanding in voice or strength, but rather in the way the room recognized in him a quiet authority born not from titles, but from time. He carried no scrolls, no pens, only the soft rustle of his robes and the faintest fragrance of old myrrh oil clinging to his sleeves. The other scribes parted like the sea to make space, and he sat not on a cushion or bench, but on the simple reed mat beside the transcription alcove. The younger scribes, including Nadir, shifted in posture, not out of fear, but attentiveness. The older man's presence did not demand it, but invited it, gently, as though saying without words, "Now we listen." "I heard," the elder said softly, his voice a cracked reed, "that tonight's work includes verses from the Kitab al-Hayawan." There was a gentle murmuring of acknowledgement. The great compendium of animals by Al-Jaiz had been recently requested by a curious vizier, one who favored knowledge of nature alongside law and astronomy. The passage in question described the lives of ants, how they organized, harvested, and communicated in mysterious, almost human ways. Strange, the elder said, how creatures without voices still managed to leave messages. Lines in dust. Holes in bark. Patterns in leaves. He looked not at anyone in particular, and yet it felt as if he were gazing directly into the mind of each scribe. "That is what we do," he continued. what you do. You are not just scribes. You are not mere copyists. You are the insects in the roots of a great tree, whispering through ink and script across generations. You think the court reads what you copy, and yes, they do, but what of the one who reads it 2 centuries from now? What of the girl in a distant province who finds these words preserved in a merchant's chest? The ink in Nadir's well rippled slightly as his hand stilled. His breath caught. He had never thought beyond the caliph or the vizier. The notion that his cramped handwriting might outlive him, might be read in a place he could not imagine, it stirred something quietly electric in his ribs. We are not merely writers, the elder scribe said, we are vessels. Hollow, but filled with something ancient. A silence followed, unbroken by pen or footfall. The brazier cracked softly. Then the elder reached into his sleeve and pulled out a scrap of faded parchment. It was torn at the edge, browned with age, barely legible. He held it up not to boast, but with the reverence of a man lifting a relic. My first script, he said with a smile. From when I was younger than most of you. I copied a verse of poetry by Ibn al-Rumi. Not for court, not for coin, only for practice. And yet, he looked around the room with wet eyes, I have carried it ever since. He placed the parchment gently on the low table in front of him. No one reached for it. To touch it would be to interrupt the sanctity of the moment. Nadir swallowed. The scrape of a stool leg nearby startled him. The others were returning to work, but with quieter hands, slower movements, as if the ink had gained weight. The elder closed his eyes and sat back against the wall. He would not sleep, not yet, but would simply listen to the scratch of pens and the breath of young men bearing a task older than any dynasty. Outside, the wind whispered faintly through the cracks in the courtyard lattice, bringing with it the smell of date palms and the sound of a distant night caller. Within the walls, however, there was only ink, and silence, and the invisible weight of words waiting to travel centuries ahead. The hour was growing late. Within the warm cocoon of the scriptorium, the flames from the oil lamps burned lower now, their light a deeper amber hue, casting long, uncertain shadows across the reed mats and narrow writing desks. The scent of hot oil had faded into something gentler, a faint trace of beeswax, ash, and the musk of old parchment. Nadir dipped his pen again, careful not to let the ink blot. The page before him was nearly complete, a short treatise on medicinal resins requested by one of the caliph's court physicians. Nothing grand, not poetry or law, but clear and precise, with diagrams that had been traced earlier by the senior illuminator before being passed to the scribes. His fingers, despite their stiffness, still moved with rhythm, and he found that his thoughts wandered freely, not in distraction, but in soft spirals. As if the mind, when permitted a quiet task, could finally drift to places untouched by worry. He thought of his father's hands, how calloused they were from stitching saddles, and how unlike his own. He thought of the neighbors down the lane who made sweet cakes of fig and sesame, and how one of them, an old widow, had once asked if he would write a prayer for her son's grave. He had done so, in exchange for nothing but a plate of the warm cakes. He wondered if she still placed it there, if the calligraphy had weathered. A quiet clearing of the throat startled him back. One of the junior scribes across the room was nodding off, his head bobbing forward in jerks before catching himself. The elder scribe, still seated quietly beneath the arch, smiled without reprimand. The ink will always wait, the old man murmured. Nadir smiled, too. It was true. The words would wait. They had waited for centuries in the minds of poets and physicians, philosophers and heretics alike. They would wait for parchment, for breath, for fingers to copy them. And they would survive in dormancy, tucked in niches and cabinets, until someone called them back into light. Another pen scratched softly behind him. Another scribe whispering a line aloud as he copied it. Each voice was low and respectful, as if the words themselves demanded gentleness. The flames of the lamps sputtered now and then as the oil thinned, causing the script to flicker on the page. Outside the scriptorium's narrow window slits, the air was cooler. The hush of night deepened. Even the wind had softened, becoming less a voice and more a breath. Distantly, in the quarters of the palace, someone passed along the marble corridor, footsteps measured, deliberate. A eunuch, perhaps, or a late servant checking the lamps. A bell somewhere deeper in the complex chimed softly. A low, single note, not to mark the hour, but to signal the end of the scribe's fourth watch. It was nearly time to stop. Nadir placed a slip of linen over the wet ink and pressed gently, absorbing the extra moisture. Then, he folded the page between its accompanying leaves and slid the work into the waiting leather folder. One by one, the scribes around him began closing their inkwells, wiping their nibs, stretching their backs without speaking. There was a sense of ceremony to the closing of a night, not festive, not solemn, but deeply rooted. Like farmers pulling the last baskets of figs from the orchard before dusk, the elder scribe rose slowly. His knees cracked, but he did not wince. He bowed slightly to the room, not out of necessity, but out of respect, and then moved toward the side door where the scrolls would be secured. Nadir lingered a moment longer. His eyes scanned the chamber, the walls lined with hanging scrolls, the faint soot marks above the lamps, the traces of ink-stained fingerprints on the edges of desks. All signs of quiet devotion. He blew gently on his hands to warm them. Then, without words, he placed the last of his parchment into the basket, wrapped his scarf over his shoulders, and joined the others as they filed silently into the corridor. Behind them, the scriptorium returned to stillness. The last lamp hissed, sputtered, and held, and somewhere in the pile of copied pages, the ink of tonight's labor began its patient waiting, for a voice, a reader, a future hand, in a city that never truly slept. The stars had shifted overhead, nudging the silvered dome of night a little closer to its zenith, and within the palace's quiet depths, Kamar sharpened his breath like a quill. All around him was silence, yet not the peaceful kind that belongs to gardens and sleeping cats, but the held-in suspense of courtiers and scribes awaiting the weight of power. The hallway beyond the scriptorium now thrummed faintly, as if holding its breath. For just beyond that final veil of cloth and stone, the caliph stirred. Kamar had never set eyes on him, not directly. Few did. And yet the man's presence was everywhere, braided into the patterns of every carpet, stitched into the velvet edges of every curtain, folded into the papers Kamar wrote on, breathed into the ink itself. Tonight, a document had arrived without herald or flourish. A folded sheet of pale lambskin vellum, sealed with black wax, a mark reserved for only the most confidential matters. The eunuch who had brought it had said nothing, only placed the scroll before Kamar and vanished once again into the velvet-lined corridors of power. The wax had cracked with a whisper under Kamar's thumbnail, revealing only a single line of instruction. In your hand, not the calligrapher's. At once. His eyes alone. It was unsigned, but he knew. It was him. The caliph. The line had been written not in formal court hand but in a brisk, narrowed scrawl. It wasn't meant for beauty, it was meant for speed and privacy. A voice speaking not through titles and ceremony, but straight from the shadows behind the throne. Kamar had inhaled once, slowly. Then he had cleared his desk, removed the ornate inks used for copying poetry or tax decrees, and drawn toward him the small lacquered box reserved for matters that passed directly to the commander of the faithful. Inside, a single vial of smoky indigo ink, its surface glimmering faintly even in low light. No one knew what was mixed into it: saffron, crushed garnet, whisper-thin soot from sacred lamps. It smelled faintly of cloves and old fire, He dipped his reed pen and waited. Not for words to come, but for himself to still. This wasn't like transcribing verses from Al-Jaiz or lists of inventory from Basra. This was the kind of writing that braided a man into history or broke him beneath it. At last, he began. The script was precise, reserved, but not cold. It bore no embellishment, no curls of ink to distract from meaning. Just facts. Movements of men. Changes in provincial command. A request, no, an instruction, regarding grain levies in Kazakhstan. And a single sentence written without any preamble: the poet has returned. He is not to be seen, but his verses will find you. Kamar paused at that. He had heard whispers in the court garden these last few nights, quiet talk of a figure once exiled returning in secret, his words smuggled in like saffron from Sind, wrapped in silk and implication. He didn't ask. It wasn't his place. He only wrote. Somewhere in the palace a low bell sounded, not an alarm, not a chime, but a muted signal. Kamar looked up, stilling his breath. The door beside him opened not with a creak but with a rustle, and a hand, smooth, ringless, faintly perfumed, extended through the curtain. Kamar rose and passed the document forward. The hand accepted it without pause. A breath. Then the curtain drew closed again. He stood motionless for a moment more, listening not for sound but for the sense of the space settling. The message had flown. What ripples it would make, what lives it would bend or end, those were not his to trace. He returned to his desk. The ink in the vial shimmered faintly, as if pleased to be poured into meaning. He capped it with care, wrapped his reed pens in linen, and reached for the brass lamp to dim it. Beyond the palace, the Tigris glided in darkness. But here, in the hush that followed the caliph's breath, even the ink seemed to hold its tongue. Kamar did not return to his usual work after the hand vanished behind the curtain. Instead, he sat for a while, hands resting loosely on the edge of the low wooden table, as if they no longer belonged to him. The ink had cooled. The silence around him had grown textured, thicker, as though the very air now remembered the caliph's presence. The lamps overhead hissed softly, their almond oil flames flickering against the intricately painted ceiling panels. In the dim glow, tiny flecks of gold leaf caught the light, stars in a painted heaven, stitched above the scribe's head. There was beauty here, yes, but also the weight of hundreds of invisible eyes. This was no longer the quiet solitude of the library. It was the heart of something that could not be seen, only felt. A vast, breathing organism with the caliph as its brain and men like Kamar as nerves and sinew. He heard movement from the hallway, padded footsteps, the gentle brush of a robe's hem, the soft cough of someone trying not to disturb. Kamar recognized the rhythm. Not a courtier. Not a eunuch. A fellow scribe. Moments later, a young man entered the chamber, bowing lightly at the threshold. His name was Safwan, barely 20 and recently appointed to the court's outer registry. He looked winded, as if he'd been running, not through corridors, but through thoughts. "There's been another dispatch," he said softly. "The merchant from Kufa, the one under suspicion, he's gone. Slipped out through the gate of the palm." Kamar said nothing, though his fingers curled slightly against the table. Safwan held out a small folded square of parchment, its edges faintly singed. "They're saying the poet helped him," he added in a whisper. That name again, the poet. Never spoken aloud, never written in the official ledgers. Only the poet. As if his very name was too volatile to capture on paper. Kamar took the parchment and unfolded it slowly. The script was rough, written in charcoal and water, meant to fade quickly. It bore a couplet, and nothing more. "The river knows which shadows lie, but sings to both the thief and spy." He exhaled through his nose. It was cryptic, yes, but in the court, everything was. Truth had to wear the mask of verse, or else it was punished. "I'll take this to the chamberlain," Safwan said, but Kamar held up his hand. "No. I will." Safwan hesitated. "You sure?" Kamar nodded. "I copied the earlier message. It may be that the threads belong to the same weave." The younger scribe withdrew, a glimmer of relief in his eyes. To carry poetry toward power was always a gamble. Verse could float harmlessly like incense, or ignite like oil. Once alone, Kamar took a moment to study the lines again. The poet's hand, though untrained in court calligraphy, had its own rhythm. Every stroke carried intent. He did not write for praise. He wrote to bend meaning, to lodge a thought into the mind of someone powerful enough to act. Kamar stood and walked across the chamber to the eastern wall, where a narrow lattice window overlooked a quiet courtyard. Below, a fig tree stood in stillness, its leaves motionless in the warm, airless dark. 2 cats sat beneath it, unmoving, watching something Kamar could not see. Above them, the stars were beginning to pale. Not with sunrise yet, but with the slow turn of night's last watch. He turned back and prepared the note for delivery. Instead of tucking it into a velvet pouch or binding it with ribbon, he rolled it into a hollow reed, the kind used for perfuming rooms with rosewater. From the outside, it was indistinguishable from 1,000 other things scattered throughout the palace. He wrapped the reed in a cloth scented with cardamom and tied it shut with a cord. Then he rang the small bell once, the one reserved not for summoning servants, but for requesting the silent courier. A boy would come, barefoot, wordless, his eyes rimmed with kohl to keep out dust. And he would know exactly where to take it. Kamar leaned back in his seat once more, letting the candlelight soften the tightness in his chest. The scribe's hand might shape letters. But the poet's voice moved like wind in the tapestries, unseen, and impossible to stop. The moon had risen higher, casting its pale glow upon the intricately carved arches of the Beit al-Hikmah's inner courtyard. Through the latticework of a high window, a stream of silvery light spilled onto the mosaic floor where Ahmad sat cross-legged, the pages of his draft illuminated by oil lamp and moonlight alike. He was not alone now. Footsteps echoed in the corridor beyond, a sound not uncommon at this hour, yet every time, it brought a flutter of tension to his chest. It was the hour of hushed arrivals and quiet scrutiny. Messengers from distant lands, scholars who worked best in silence, and guards who checked corridors like shadows moving behind veils, each passed without disturbing the work of those sworn to parchment and ink. Tonight, however, the visitor who paused in the threshold of the scriptorium was no mere figure of routine. It was the vizier's steward, cloaked in a deep blue kaftan, his beard dusted with the silver of age and experience. "Ahmad ibn Yusuf," the man said softly, hands folded behind his back. "The vizier requests your presence." "Bring the draft." With only a nod, Ahmad carefully rolled his parchment and secured it with a strip of dyed leather. His hands did not tremble, but within, something tightened. To be summoned at this hour was unusual. It could mean correction, or worse, displeasure. Yet he had done his work with precision, cross-checked the citations from the Greek, the Sanskrit, and the Syriac, and even taken the liberty of footnoting where the physicians disagreed. He had done his duty. Still, the weight of the call pressed on him like the thick scent of ink clinging to his skin. They moved swiftly through the marble corridors, past a courtyard garden where the scent of jasmine hovered in the air like memory. Lanterns flickered along the colonnades, their flames dancing against polished stone. The silence was deep, save for the soft slap of their sandals and the occasional trill of a night bird. In the distance, the call of a lone muezzin rose from a rooftop minaret, not for prayer, but perhaps as a ward against the night's secrets. At last, they entered a smaller chamber off the main hall, its walls lined with manuscripts and scrolls sealed in lacquered boxes. There, behind a cedarwood desk, sat the vizier himself, Al-Hassan ibn Khalid, a man whose name was whispered in the same breath as the caliph's, whose intellect and memory were famed across the empire. His robe was dark as ink, but his fingers glittered with rings, lapis, carnelian, and one etched with a Kufic verse. He gestured Ahmad forward, eyes not yet lifted from the open scroll in front of him. "You've translated the section on humors with care," he murmured, his voice like water over smooth stone. "But here," he tapped a spot near the bottom, "you've chosen the word melancholia, where sada might serve more fittingly. Do you understand why?" Ahmad swallowed. "Because melancholia implies a condition of mind, while sada speaks to the quality of the black bile itself, its excess or imbalance." The vizier looked up now, and there was a spark, not of reprimand, but of approval. "Just so," he said. "You honor the spirit of Galen without betraying the understanding of our physicians." Ahmad let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "You will copy the fair version tonight. The caliph desires to see the completed chapter by morning." The steward stepped forward and offered Ahmad a silk-wrapped parcel, the finest parchment, cut and pressed with precision, its surface smoother than any he had yet touched that evening. With a low bow, Ahmad accepted it, his heart filled not with fear now, but with the solemn pride of responsibility. This was more than copying. This was preservation. Translation. Transmission. He returned to the scriptorium, where the lamp still burned low and steady. He unfurled the new parchment, arranged his tools with ritual-like calm, reed pen, fresh ink block, a whetstone to sharpen the nib. The vizier's words echoed in his mind, not as critique but as music, a reminder of the legacy flowing through his hands. And as he drew the first clean line of ink across the page, he knew, this work was not only for the caliph or the vizier, but for the generations that would come after, reading these same words by different lights, in lands yet unknown. In that moment, Ahmad was not merely a scribe. He was a thread in the tapestry of knowledge, woven by quiet, deliberate hands in the deep of night. The candle was nearing its end. Its wick, once proud and tall, now sputtered faintly in its bed of wax. A soft hiss escaped with each tiny collapse of flame, like the last exhalation of a sleeping bird. Shadows thickened at the edges of the scribe's chamber as the gentle radius of golden light narrowed. Ibrahim blinked, his eyes rimmed with tired salt. The page before him trembled faintly with the flicker of the flame, its surface pale and uneven, awaiting the final touches of the illuminated verse he had traced with such care. The ink had long since dried to a muted black, but still he traced it in his mind, syllable by syllable, feeling the rhythm of the caliph's poet settle in his bones. He inhaled deeply and exhaled through parted lips. No sound, just the sigh of warm air meeting colder stone. Outside the chamber, the murmur of the palace had settled to near silence. The wind had stilled. The marble corridors, so full of life hours earlier, servant sandals, echoing laughter, the clink of goblets, now stood as hollow vessels of memory. Even the night birds seemed to have paused their chorus. He rose slowly, joints stiff, and crossed to the low window. Below, Baghdad slumbered under a velvety darkness. The domes and minarets of the round city appeared like ghostly mounds, barely touched by moonlight. The great Tigris shimmered in long, broken lines of silver far off to the east. Ibrahim could smell the faint breath of river reed and dust, stirred by the heat that lingered from the day. He thought of those still awake, fishermen readying their small boats, the watchman pacing the palace walls, a mother coaxing a fevered child into sleep. And among them, the other silent ones, the scribes in other wings, the mathematicians deep in their calculations, the poets whispering drafts to the stars. He was not truly alone. He stepped back to his desk and opened the shallow drawer beneath it. Within lay his finer tools, a reed pen honed to a whisper-fine point, its shaft wrapped in delicate thread, a shallow bowl with powdered indigo pigment, a bone knife for trimming, a compact stone weight shaped like a falcon to steady curling pages. These were instruments not of war, but of stillness. Their work was slow, precise, and lasting. He removed the pen and dipped it once more, though no ink remained. There, on the final margin of the parchment, he marked a single decorative curl. A flourish, subtle but deliberate, like the final note of a lyre's song. Not necessary to the verse, but necessary to him. It was his way of saying I was here. The candle fluttered again. Ibrahim leaned closer, eyes soft, and whispered to the page, "It will outlive me." A whisper to no one, yet not wasted. He rolled the parchment gently, tying it with silk thread dyed the color of dried figs. Into a narrow scroll box it went, lacquered wood with brass bands, etched with the emblem of the House of Wisdom. He sealed the lid with beeswax and pressed a stamp carved with the crescent of Al-Mamun. Not for secrecy, but for respect. The last task of the night. And still the flame endured. He poured water from a ceramic jug into a shallow basin and rinsed his hands, scrubbing away the last film of ink. The cold touch of the water startled him, his fingers had grown numb. He dried them on a linen square embroidered by his sister. The simple pattern of fig leaves and date clusters warmed him more than the fabric itself. He moved next to the brazier and stoked it gently, stirring the ashes with an iron hook until the coals glowed faintly again. The scent of cedar embers swirled upward, smoky and faintly sweet. He closed his eyes and remembered the gardens of his youth, orange blossoms, sandalwood trees, and the voice of his father reciting lines of poetry as birds dipped low to the fountain's edge. When he opened his eyes, the candle gave its final breath. Darkness folded over the room like a robe, but Ibrahim did not flinch. He reached slowly toward the small shelf beside the desk, his fingers trained by habit. There he found a second candle, shorter, but sufficient. He lit it from the coals of the brazier with the steadiness of long routine. Light bloomed once more, and with it, the night continued, not hurried, not loud, but ever turning. The hush over Pompeii deepened as the final shimmer of sunlight fled the cobbled streets, replaced by the flickering light of oil lamps and the subtle glow from distant hearths. The flower shop, once bustling and fragrant, now stood in stillness, its doorway left half-shuttered to welcome the cooling breeze that crept in from the sea. Mela, seated cross-legged on a worn reed mat, slowly threaded the last of her marigold petals onto a fine flax string, fingers moving automatically, the rhythm of muscle memory and nightly ritual. The scent of crushed stems and lingering myrrh seemed more vivid in the quiet. Outside, the night carried a strange stillness. Not just the quiet of routine rest, but something tighter, tauter, like a note held too long on a lute string. Mela's cat, a silver-gray thing named Ulula, paced the threshold with uncharacteristic unease, tail twitching at invisible things. Every so often, the clay jars in the back of the shop gave off soft creaks as though disturbed by something more than air. A low murmur rose from a group of neighbors seated in the alley. They weren't gossiping as usual, but speaking in hushed tones about the distant rumblings from Vesuvius. Nothing new, they reminded each other, it had growled before. Hot springs burbled, earth shifted, the gods stirred and then slept again. Still, something in their eyes betrayed a flicker of worry. Mela pretended not to hear. She had petals to dry, garlands to weave, customers expecting temple offerings at sunrise. She stepped into the narrow courtyard behind the shop, where the air was warmer still. There, laid out on a simple rope line, hung bundles of herbs to dry, lavender, sage, rue. Overhead, stars tried to pierce the thin veil of cloud, but even they seemed distant tonight. Mela reached for a small amphora of rosewater and sprinkled a few drops over the threshold, a quiet prayer to Fortuna for peace through the night. When she returned indoors, the little oil lamp flickered violently once, then steadied. The ground seemed to sway beneath her, just faintly, like the rock of a boat's hull tied too loose at dock. She stood still, lips parted, eyes scanning the walls for signs. A small bowl on a shelf had shifted, just enough for her to notice. Then silence again. She turned back to the mat, lifted the completed garland, now limp with the weight of its own perfume, and hung it gently upon a hook near the altar to Flora. It would dry in the night. If all went well, it would crown the statue of a young bride tomorrow morning. But as Mela settled near her pallet, wrapping herself in a linen shawl that smelled faintly of sun and earth, the wind outside shifted direction. It was subtle, an inland breeze now, cool and dry, carrying not salt, but a hint of sulfur. She frowned. The hearth smoke in her neighbors' homes drifted strangely, as if pressed by invisible hands. Ulula let out a long, low mewl and darted beneath the low table. Mela lay on her side, eyes fixed on the outline of the flower baskets. They seemed like soft ghosts in the half-dark. She could almost hear the echoes of the day's laughter, the customers' requests, the clink of coins, the brush of petals against skin. Her hand reached beneath her shawl and found the smooth stem of a dried lotus tucked in her belt, a personal charm, given long ago by her mother. Another tremor, more distinct this time. A faint rattle, then stillness again. She did not rise. There was nothing to be done. Instead, she whispered into the dark, voice barely audible above the quiet pulse of the earth beneath her, "Let it pass." Petals drifted from a garland hung too close to the window, catching in the faint draft. They fluttered like silent prayers, lost to the night. Outside, a dog barked. Then another. The wind thickened, and the ink of night deepened, silent, waiting. The darkness just before dawn in Pompeii had a particular quality, dense and tender, like the stillness inside a cocoon. It wrapped around the narrow streets and stone walls, muffling the last of the city's nocturnal sounds. Most homes lay quiet now, their occupants caught somewhere between the final threads of dream and the first stirrings of waking life. But in the modest flower shop tucked into the outer lane near the gate of Herculaneum, sleep had not fully come. Mela lay curled upon her rush mat, her shawl drawn over her shoulder, her face turned toward the cool clay wall. Her breathing was even, but her body remained tense. The cat, Ulula, had taken refuge beside her feet, something she rarely did unless the wind howled hard from the mountains. The scent of old petals clung to the air, and outside the shuttered doorway, the scent of the sea was faint, almost absent. Even the gulls had fallen strangely quiet. Somewhere far off, a cartwheel creaked, and then all was still again. In the edge of sleep, Mela's mind drifted to the dream that had visited her in fragments all night, a girl running barefoot across a field of marigolds, arms outstretched, chasing the sound of bells. But when she neared the sound, she found only smoke. Always, the same ending. And each time, the girl's hair turned to ash in the wind. She stirred gently, eyelids fluttering. A faint tremor tickled her senses, not quite enough to rouse her fully. The amphora on the shelf beside her gave the softest clink. The movement was not unnatural, not terrifying, but it was noticed, just as the heart notices a skipped beat. Outside, the first light had not yet come, but the horizon behind Vesuvius had begun to pale, not with pinks or golds, but with a dull, powdery gray. It looked like morning viewed through dusty glass. Within the shop, the garlands hung in stillness. Bouquets prepared the day before, bundles of rosemary and poppy, yarrow and iris, rested in shallow bowls of water that had grown slightly murky. Mela had not risen to replace it. She had forgotten, or perhaps simply chosen to let them fade. A strange lethargy, like the city itself, seemed to have settled into her limbs. And yet, the duties of mourning waited. From beneath her shawl, Mela drew her hand and touched her chest, where a pressed flower, an old violet, nearly crumbling, was tucked into the fold of her tunic. She murmured something wordless, then finally opened her eyes. The light inside the room was still blue and cold. She sat up slowly, careful not to disturb the cat still dozing against her feet. Her bones ached faintly, as they often did when the weather shifted. Her grandmother would have said that the gods stirred when the joints cried out. Mela wasn't sure what she believed anymore, but today, the ache in her hands felt heavier than usual. She reached for a wooden bowl of water and splashed her face, inhaling deeply. The water was cool and tasted faintly of iron. No time for tea, no time for food. Her fingers brushed the edge of the garland she had hung last night, marigold, rose, and sage. Still intact. She lifted it with both hands and kissed it lightly, a private gesture of thanks, then laid it on the altar by the window. The incense holder was nearly burned through. She would need to refill it. She always refilled it. But this morning, she paused. Why does everything feel so far away? The thought came suddenly, unbidden. And then, a sound, barely audible, but distinct. A dull crack from somewhere beyond the street. Not wood. Not stone. Something deeper, stranger, almost like the sound of a branch breaking under too much weight, but from beneath the earth itself. She looked toward the doorway. The light outside had not changed, but the wind had shifted again. Outside, the street remained empty. The first steps of day had not yet touched the paving stones. The light was dim and metallic, like water passed through tin. Mela stepped outside, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders, the woven threads thin but familiar. Her feet, still bare, met the coolness of the stone, and she flinched. Pompeii held its breath. There were no merchants setting up stalls, no echoing calls from the baker's lane, no gossip rising from courtyards or clatter of amphorae against stone. Only the faint rustling of dry leaves swept in from beyond the city gate. And beneath it all, something else, a silence too complete. She looked up at the sky. Vesuvius stood dark against it, the summit barely visible through a veil of fine mist, or was it dust? The mountain had always loomed, sometimes warmly, like a sleeping protector. Now, it felt alert. Like an animal listening from its cave. Returning inside, Mela began her work as if the world outside were unchanged. She moved slowly, tenderly, from task to task, removing wilted petals from the offering bowls, adding drops of oil to the tired garlands, whispering quiet blessings to each bundle. She lit a fresh stick of incense, watching the first curl of smoke rise and disappear into the shadows of the rafters. But her hands trembled. Each task brought with it a memory, each flower a name. She touched the last of her irises and thought of the widow Claudia, who had once wept in this very shop after her son's funeral. She had asked for violets and rosemary, and Mela had woven them with myrtle and cedar. "I want him to smell the sea," the woman had whispered. Now, that same mix sat in a jar by the door, waiting for a buyer who had not returned. Mela ran her fingers over the rim of the jar. Across the shop, a wooden shelf trembled ever so slightly. She froze. Then again, barely perceptible, a low vibration, like a sound without sound. The incense stick, perched delicately in its clay holder, quivered. The thin ash of its tip broke off in a slow spiral and landed on the floor. From the roof, a single bit of plaster dust fell, drifting down like a soft feather. Her heart was beating faster now, though she tried to pretend it wasn't. Earthquakes were not rare here. A tremor now and then, a cracked wall, an unbalanced jug, these were known, accepted. They were parts of living with the land, of being near the mountain. But this this was not a tremor. This was a hush before something unnamed. She reached for her bundle of marigolds and held them close to her chest. Their scent was sharp, pungent, grounding. The same kind she had laid at her mother's altar on the day she turned 16. What did that priest say once? The gods send scent before fire. She had laughed at that then. Now the words felt like ash in her throat. Still, the shop must remain. The shutters must be checked. The buckets of water refilled. The garlands must be freshened, and the altar reswept. She moved from task to task, as if the repetition might push back the stillness around her. The wind shifted again. This time, it brought a faint taste to her lips, bitter, dry. Almost metallic. Not smoke, but something close. She looked again toward the horizon. There was a strange shimmer in the air, like heat rising from stones, though it was not yet warm. She blinked and it vanished. Then, from down the street, came a soft sound, a voice? No, a bell. A single, tiny bell ringing from the direction of the temple of Isis. Perhaps a priestess preparing the dawn rites, she thought. Or perhaps, she couldn't finish the thought. Instead, she turned back toward the shop, one hand on the doorframe, the other still holding the marigolds. Behind her, the first fine flakes of ash, light as flour, began to fall from the sky. The night deepens as the oil lamps burn low, their flames flickering like the breath of forgotten spirits across the tiled floor. Shadows dance across the library walls, elongated, trembling figures that sway to the rhythm of the hour. Outside, the city has grown quieter still, the air cooler, perfumed faintly with the scent of night jasmine creeping along the garden walls of the palace courtyard. One could almost forget the weight of empire and the fragility of scrolls in this moment of stillness. Umar sits alone now, the other scribes having quietly drifted away to their quarters or to their evening meditations. The long desk before him is empty save for a single ivory scroll rod, freshly polished, and a square of indigo cloth beneath it. This final document is not part of the regular archives. No court order, no financial record, no astronomical observation. It is a letter, dictated hours earlier by a high-ranking official to be sent to Samara. Private, urgent, and sealed in secrecy. He unwinds the scroll with care. The vellum has been dusted and smoothed, and the faint lines ruled across it earlier by one of the apprentices now catch the glint of lamplight. Umar selects a reed pen, the same one he has used since dusk, and trims its nib once more with his small bronze blade. His movements are slow, measured, like ritual. A scribe does not rush his final words of the night. The ink in his stone well has thickened ever so slightly, cooled by the night air. He stirs it with the pen's nib, coaxing life back into its depths. The first stroke is a tall olive, straight and steady. It anchors the rest. Words flow from it like the Tigris in spring, steady, inevitable, and edged with precision. Each word is weighed before written. This letter carries implications far beyond the library's humble walls, perhaps troop movements, or the reassignment of governorships. Umar does not pry, but he senses the gravity in the phrasing, the formality bordering on veiled command. The calligraphy must not only be beautiful, it must carry the authority of the court. As he writes, the silence deepens. No footsteps echo from the outer hall. Even the fountains seem hushed. The only sound is the whisper of pen on parchment and the occasional creak of the wooden desk beneath his forearms. Above him, through the narrow clerestory windows, the sky opens like a dark scroll of its own. The moon now hangs low, a silver sickle watching over Baghdad, bathing the upper edges of the arches in a faint glow. He does not pause until the final word. Then, he lifts the pen, holding it above the parchment, letting the ink dry naturally. No sand to blot, not for a letter of this stature. He leans back, exhaling slowly. His shoulders ache, his eyes sting. But there is a calm that comes with the final flourish, like the last stroke of a brush over a well-finished painting. He rolls the scroll tightly, binds it with a thin cord of dyed silk, and presses a seal into the wax disc, heated over the lamp. The seal bears the stylized Kufic emblem of the court, unmistakable and precise. When finished, he wraps it in the indigo cloth and sets it aside for the morning courier. There is a brief moment where he simply sits and watches the sealed letter. Not with pride, but with quiet understanding. This is what it means to serve ink, not power. The scribe's role is invisible but enduring, like the binding thread of a grand tapestry no eye sees but every form relies upon. He glances out the small window once more. The moon has shifted slightly. Somewhere in the city, a dog barks faintly and is silenced. The night is almost done, but the ink remains. Waiting, as it always does, for the next thought, the next hand, the next story. With practiced hands, Umar closes the ink well, wipes the reed pen, and snuffs the lamp. A faint blue washes the edges of the eastern sky, softening the shadows that cling to the palace's marble columns. Though the stars still glimmer above the city's dome-studded horizon, their brightness has begun to fade, surrendering, slowly and without complaint, to the approach of morning. The cool air drifting through the stone corridors carries the first breath of light with it, and with that breath comes the hush of transition. The hour between darkness and day is neither one nor the other, and it belongs entirely to silence. Umar, having gathered and sorted his tools, moves quietly across the library chamber. The reed pens, inkstones, seal stamps, and fine cloths have all been returned to their proper niches. Each shelf bears its own rhythm, its own carefully remembered order. A misplaced penknife, a scroll left unrolled, could disturb the harmony of the next night. Nothing must remain out of place, not in the house of wisdom, not under his watch. His sandals whisper across the polished floor as he passes under an archway whose Makarna's carvings seem to shimmer faintly in the half-light. Above him, a skylight just beginning to glow pours a narrow stream of pale light onto the center of the reading floor, like a divine spotlight cast upon empty cushions and dormant manuscripts. In the shadowy alcove near the eastern wall, a servant has placed a small copper tray bearing a porcelain cup of barley tea. The tea is still steaming, though faintly. Umar did not ask for it, he never does, but someone knew. They always do. He pauses beside the cup and sits for a moment, his back against a carved lattice screen. The wooden slats let in a ripple of breeze that stirs the hem of his robe. He sips, and the tea is earthy, faintly sweet, and grounding. Outside, a muezzin's voice finally stirs the silence. The call to Far, the morning prayer, rises like a ribbon of smoke through the dawn sky. Prayer is better than sleep, the voice proclaims, and Umar closes his eyes. He does not rise. Not yet. Instead, his mind drifts to the scrolls he copied tonight, the details of cities he has never seen, of decisions he will never make, and names he must remember only long enough to spell them correctly. There is something quietly miraculous in it, to inscribe power without wielding it, to preserve memory without being remembered. He feels no bitterness in this thought. Only gratitude. As the final echoes of the call to prayer fade into the tiled corridors, another presence enters the chamber. It is one of the night guards, his chainmail softly clinking as he moves through the shadows with the familiarity of routine. The man nods to Umar, not formally, but with a shared understanding. Two men awake when others sleep. Two witnesses to a world few see. The scribe nods back, drinks the final mouthful of tea, and rises. He smooths the folds of his robe and begins a slow walk toward the library's side doors, now faintly lit by the earliest blush of sun. As he moves, his fingertips trail briefly across the spines of several scrolls resting in the archive cubbies, just enough to remind him of their texture. To anchor himself in what he served. Outside, the garden waits. The same garden he entered through 12 hours ago, its pathways now scattered with dew. The sky above it is no longer black but bruised blue and lavender, streaked with the fire promise of sun. A single bird calls, tentative at first, then confident. More will follow. Umar crosses into the garden. The coolness of morning wraps around him like a cloak. Behind him, the great doors of the library close. Not with finality, but with rhythm. The night has passed. The ink has dried. And the story sleeps, now, within the scrolls, until night returns again. And so, the palace sleeps again behind him. The house of wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, rests in the hush of a city that has not yet fully woken. Behind its domed roofs and wind-swept parapets, behind the marble walls veined with blue-gray and ochre, behind the oiled cedar doors, knowledge rests, quiet and still, like a sleeping garden beneath frost. But not forgotten. Umar steps out into the garden path where he first entered 12 hours ago. Now the earth glistens faintly under a skin of dew. The breeze, once filled with night's cool sharpness, has softened. Above the garden wall, the earliest streaks of rose and saffron stretch across the sky. Baghdad stirs beyond the gates, but not yet fully. It is that suspended moment between dreaming and waking, when all things still seem possible. His footsteps are soft upon the stone path, barely disturbing the hush. The scent of damp jasmine curls in the air. In the branches of the fig tree near the gate, a pair of small birds begin to shuffle in the leaves. He listens for them, not with his ears, but with his whole body, absorbing their quiet existence like a wordless verse. Umar reaches the outer gate and pauses. There is no ceremony to mark the end of his work. No proclamation, no gold seal, no audience. The scrolls he copied will find their way to scholars and ministers and caliphal chambers. His name will not travel with them. His labor, precise and unseen, will fold into the weight of the empire like a single stitch in a vast garment. But he does not seek recognition. He slips the chain latch from the gate and steps into the alley beyond. His sandals brush against dry dust and scattered fig leaves. The city is beginning to awaken, smoke curls from distant rooftops, and the bleat of a goat echoes faintly down a side lane. The perfume of baking flatbread mingles with the tang of iron from a blacksmith's early bell. The streets of Baghdad are not yet full, but neither are they empty. A veiled woman walks briskly with a water jug balanced against her hip. A boy leads 2 donkeys toward the riverbank. A baker, sleeves white with flour, unlatches his stall window, and Umar walks among them, robe ink-stained and slightly wrinkled, shoulders tired, mind still shaped by parchment and lines. He does not hurry. He will pass the mosque, where men now gather for prayer. He will nod to the fruit vendor setting out his apricots. He will arrive at his small courtyard home just as the first sunlight touches the lintel, where a faded wooden bench waits for him beside a vine of creeping bougainvillea. There, he will wash. Perhaps sleep. Perhaps not. Perhaps he will sit and watch the light move across the floor, and allow his hands to remember the motions of the night, the way a reed pen is carved, the exact pressure required to guide it across a line, the weight of a scroll unrolling like time itself. And when night falls again, and it always does, he will return. The palace will open its gates. The lamps will be lit. The scribes will gather in silence, and the ink will wait. It always waits, because memory is not only kept in the mind, it is kept in hands. In gestures. In silence. And in the ink that writes by lamplight, and sleeps by dawn. The house of wisdom is never truly dark. And Umar, the quiet scribe, is never truly gone, only waiting. Back in his modest home tucked into a quiet courtyard in the Harbiya quarter, Umar has finally laid down his reed pen. The day has grown around him. Sunlight leans against the window shutters in pale slants. Outside, the usual murmur of donkeys and vendors begins to rise, voices rolling like warm water across stone alleys. But inside, the world remains still. The door is shut. The sandals are placed neatly beside a cushion. And in the corner, a rolled scroll lies beneath a simple linen cloth, cooling like a baked loaf of bread. Umar sits cross-legged on the woven mat, arms resting in his lap. His inkwell, now lidded, stands like a sleeping creature at his side. The ink within is dark, quiet, deep as night. His fingers still bear the shadow of letters, smudges that no washing removes entirely. Between the creases of his knuckles and the beds of his nails, the ink remains. And in truth, he does not mind. For what is ink if not memory made visible? It is the proof that thought has passed through him. That somewhere, someone might one day read a line and not know his name, but feel his care, his hand, the pressure of his attention. He leans back slowly and breathes. Above him, through the wooden lattice of the mashrabiyah, a single shaft of golden light lands on the wall. It illuminates the corner where his reference scrolls are stored, bundled in cloth and string. The scent of dry parchment and cedar oil lingers in the air. There is no wind, only the heat beginning to thicken, another day taking hold of the world. In this small room, time softens. Umar's eyes drift to the low shelf beside his mat. Upon it rests his grandfather's pen-knife, still sharp. The old man's astrolabe, slightly tarnished, leans against the wall. And there, tucked inside a leather pouch, are a few of his own letters, fragments of days past. A note of gratitude from a merchant. A poem given to him by a fellow scribe, scrawled hastily on the back of an account. A prayer, written in trembling hand, from his mother before she passed. Each piece, a memory. Each line, ink that once flowed from someone else's hand, now cradled in his. He lifts one letter and holds it between thumb and forefinger. The parchment is dry and light, like the wings of a moth. He reads it silently, eyes moving across the old Arabic script, the strokes familiar and soft. He does not need to read the words aloud, he knows them. They have lived with him for years. And as he reads, he feels a calm settle into his spine, a stillness that is neither sleep nor waking, but something between, a kind of prayer. Then, carefully, he folds the letter again and returns it to its pouch. Outside, children begin to play in the alley. The tap of feet on stone, the call of a mother, the low bray of a mule. Baghdad unfolds its day. Umar does not yet rise. He sits in silence, body still but mind lingering somewhere in the inkwells of the night, where thoughts are shaped in shadows, and truths written with care upon scrolls no one sees being born. His labor is quiet. His name may never be carved in marble. But he is part of something larger, a thread in the loom of knowledge, a candle among stars, a vessel for memory in a world that forgets so easily. He reaches for his pen again, not to work, but to clean it. To run his fingers along its shape. To honor it, because tomorrow night, or the next after that, the ink will call him again, and he will answer. With quiet hands, and steady breath, and eyes trained to see the spaces between the words. In Baghdad, in the year 832, where wisdom lives in stone and silence, a scribe's duty never truly ends. It only waits, like ink in a sealed jar. Patient. Eternal.